Councillor Doug Taylor, who you already met. So you'll know he's leader of Enfield Council, but I don't think he mentioned he's on the London Sports Advisory Board as the London Council's representative, working with Kate Hoey and advising the Mayor, who we haven't heard a lot about today, the Mayor of London. You know, we do have a system in London, which is a mayoralty, which maybe we can start to think about as well. So there's a relationship with government, local authorities, schools also, but we do have this system in London, which is different from anywhere else in England. So anyway, Doug is going to give us a presentation, I think, about the work of Enfield Council. But there's some other areas which we may want to think about when we get to the Q&A session. Can I invite you to the stage?
Thank you, John. It's been a pretty heavy morning so far, and I'm not necessarily going to make it any lighter in terms of discussion, but I am going to try and concentrate on Enfield. And as a local politician, of course, there are a whole series of issues and pressures, countervailing pressures that we're subject to, and issues about sport, culture, leisure become only one of them. But I was very keen that as a local authority we reviewed what our legacy was and what we'd set out to achieve during the Olympic period, and what it was we had achieved and what was the future. So only last week at our cabinet meeting, and this is the wonderful cabinet report, and I can talk to you if you want about issues as interesting as the proposed submission development management document, but I'm not planning to do that. What I am going to do is simply to refer to the fact that we had our own review on the Olympics, and officers went through, and so we could actually consider the extent to which there was a legacy and how we wish to take that forward. And I'd be interested to know how many other local authorities have actually gone through that process. Because one of the things about politics, of course, is that everything is the next challenge rather than necessarily in what you've just done. But I think it is important to consider in that sort of way, because at the end of the day, we all have to ration resources, and in rationing resources, we have to prioritise and deprioritise. And I will come back to that theme in a second, but unless you actually look at what it is that you intended to achieve, what was achieved, and what that's contributed, I think you can lose sight of where you need to go. Now, one of the things about PowerPoint is I always think there's an iron law of PowerPoint, and that is one of the presentations will go wrong. As I'm having a slight trouble with getting the slide together, I thought I'd start with a bit of indication of legacy, and you may recognise the gentleman in the middle of the Union Jack there as Co. This is a running track that was renovated. This is a listed building that was renovated, and in the middle of the running track we host Enfield Town Football Club. I put this up because I think legacy can be something that's physical, it can be an infrastructure, and this is an example of something that will be to the benefit of local residents for many years to come. And I think Sebco is still the record holder for, I think it might have been 1,500 metres on the track. Not on that particular day, although on that particular day he did do some hurdling, if I recollect, so he had his own Alan Pascoe moment. Now I just want to talk about some of the things that from the council perspective, and I think it is a mixed picture, and I'm going to try and develop that theme as we go through. An awful lot of people were involved in the torch relay, saw the torch relay. We had a very high participation from individuals as games makers, and indeed we celebrated the games makers. I think it's one of the plugs I might want to give at the start, is I was surprised. We held a reception for them in a renovated new building that we have, in fact an old building, newly renovated. And I was surprised that we were one of the few, and maybe the first, to actually do anything to celebrate the work that they had individually done. And that, I think, was important in terms of recognition, but also important in terms of building a legacy for them to feel that they might wish to continue to volunteer in the locality. We had a high percentage, 100% of schools joined the Get Set network. I'm going to come on in a little minute to the primary schools sports funding. I've already referred to the investment in some of our infrastructure and we've also invested in our leisure centres. High levels of primary age obesity. We've got some of the highest levels of obesity in primary children in London, and that is a real challenge, and sport obviously can play a part in trying to tackle that particular issue. There are very big and real pressures on councils, and anybody who reads The Guardian will see that the front page story in The Guardian today is about the significant pressure on councils, and I'll refer to that in a second. And also issues around council tax and benefit changes. There are going to be extra pressures on individuals. I'll tell a little story, not directly related to the Olympics, but related to sport. We have, in the ward I represent, a significant Bangladeshi community, and they are some of the poorest in our borough. And Enfield is a borough with some very rich people and some very poor people, an area of quite large levels of diversity, where the life expectancy for a woman in the east of the borough is 12 years less than in the west of the borough. Huge discrepancy. In terms of my ward, a Bangladeshi community, pretty poor, interested in developing some cricket for the kids, trying to develop an ability for some extra activity. Not purely Bangladeshi, also some interest from the Somali and Turkish community. I think we've got a couple of boys from the Turkish community who played. But they ran out of funding. And they're a community that individually are not able to spend the amount of money on coaching and so on and so forth. We were able, through some local ward budgets we have, to be able to provide some funding for them. But I think at a time of pressure on individuals' pockets, certainly for those in the poorest of our communities, there will be significant pressures on their ability to be able to provide that sort of support, the booking of pitches, the booking of coaches, the transport and so on and so forth. Interestingly enough, when I asked them what their aspiration was, it was that one of the boys would play Test cricket at Lord's for England, not for Bangladesh. And after our performance in New Zealand, that might be very welcome. So generally tough times, residents and councils under pressure. And I know there will be colleagues in the audience from local authorities, but I do think it's worth mentioning, and it's something that the Guardian article today talks about, the local government association's graph of doom, which shows that those statutory services that are provided by local authorities, adult social care, waste disposal, concession, travel, are on an upward trajectory because of obvious costs and demographics. But the ability and the amount of money local authorities have got is on a downward trajectory. So what gets squeezed in that? Well, what gets squeezed is what's discretionary. And sport and leisure are discretionary. So therefore there will be a very significant pressure on all of us in local authorities. And that's why I think prioritisation is a very important debate and discussion to have. Why the case needs to be made for the importance of sport. Different strands to the Council's sport and physical activity. I'm not going to go through them all in any detail. Some of them are things that pay for themselves, so commercial sports programme where people pay to go on activities, but we also supplement that with a free sports programme as well. I want to refer to the provision of positive activities because one of the things, certainly in London, half of the boroughs in London are affected by some level of issues around gangs. One of the things we like to do, what we support, is the issue of youth diversion, what sport can do to try and encourage young people to take part in certain activities. And finally, the health agenda, which I think has been referred to already. I referred to it in terms of obesity, but a whole series of other medical conditions that can develop through a sedentary lifestyle. And as we've now taken over the public health responsibility, then I think we can do something about that. So that's a pretty dour and pretty depressing in some respects, a factual start. But it is about inspiring, and it's about inspiring young people. And Desiree Henry here, who was a 200 metre world youth champion, born in the borough, went to school in the borough, a torchbearer. These sorts of role models, I think, are very significant in inspiring the young people in the borough. That ability to show that you can get to the very top is something that will affect, and I think can inspire, a certain proportion of our young people. Now we suggest there are 5 strands to the legacy. Training a fleet of young games makers, and I'll come back to that just in a second. Visits by Olympians and Paralympians to schools. Boccia, and I'm sure everybody in the room knows what boccia is, but I'll make a reference to that in a second. Schools achieving the National PE Award and developing the outstanding movers. Now, I'm going to come to each of these separately. But before that, we did get 55,000 children inspired in our torch relay. Schools all took part. We had assemblies in parks. The Mayor visited every one of these events. We took the opportunity of ensuring that we were able to encourage young people during that process of the Games to want to watch the Games, to want to understand it, and to feel they were a part of it themselves. I mentioned the Games Makers. We also tried to develop our own young Games Makers, and I have one of these polo shirts. Spookily, the colours are very similar to Saracens, but not sponsored, I noticed, by Saracens, but there's always that opportunity. So this is something. Here is our branding, and as we've pointed out, to me quite similar to the Games Makers in the Olympics with the little flash downside. I'm sure we can explain to you, and Jan, who works for Councillor, is in the audience, how we sourced it, how much they cost, and so on and so forth. But again, we want to encourage young people to be involved in organisation as well as participation in sports, and as the slide explains, the sorts of things that we would hope would develop out of that. Again, an Olympian visiting the school, Anna Jamili, almost made the 200 metres final. Hopefully next time, we'll make the 200 metres final. Next time, win a medal. But the important thing, I think, is again about using role models to attend and encourage and show. And of course, he's only 10 years older than some of the kids in this primary school that this thing is about. So getting that connection, I think, is significantly important. We want to encourage, and I talked about these sort of elite athletes, but we want to encourage sport for all. So boccia in all our schools, the ability to try and promote participation for everyone in sport, to encourage both from a social and a health point of view. We're very encouraged by receiving 8 of our schools achieving the Gold Award for this, only 70 schools nationally. So we're the top performing local authority in this area, and I think that's a testament both to the involvement of the schools but also to the work that our staff in the council have done to ensure that schools are hooked in. The outstanding move is about developing dexterity, spatial awareness, movement in young people, so they can then develop and take an interest as they go forward. I'm sure you're all aware of the chart earlier showed the dropout rate from 16 onwards. Of course, I think it'd be interesting to look at what happens to people in that period pre-16 and what triggers dropout in much earlier. So we want to encourage all our children. We want them to all be able to participate. So as we say, we're trying to develop and encourage teachers in early years to be able to develop that particular confidence. Now, I suppose throwing out a challenge, the funding for primary schools is welcome. I would always say this, wouldn't I, but is it sufficient? Will it achieve outstanding and consistent and sustainable change? I always make a bid for more money, but it is about priorities, it is about resource allocation at the end of the day. I held an event with colleagues, if any are in the audience, from London local authorities about what it is that they would like to see in order to use the London Community Sports money and other money. And I think one of the interesting things that came out was at a time of restrictions and reductions in local authority funding, what disappears is some of the ability to write submissions, some of the ability to fill in forms. So what most of these slides are really about, to what extent can we simplify processes and remove bureaucracy? To what extent can we reduce the form filling required in order to be able to access cash? Because if the process of acquisition is so complicated, if the hurdles to be jumped over are so high, then are we actually just preventing people from seeking to develop? Because within their own local authority there's been a reduction in capacity to do that. And I think that's something we need to be clever about. We need to obviously retain accountability. Accountability for spending money is important, but are there ways that we can make that process simpler? So I talked about the local authorities, LGA's graph of doom. We need to be creative, we need to be innovative in order to achieve best bang for the buck. We want to support, as a council, and all councils need to support the clubs and providers within their area. We want to link in with the health agenda. So for older people, is the offer from the GP statins to reduce cholesterol, or is it to try and increase health activity through swimming? I use that simply because there's an alliteration there. But the point I'm making is quite simply there are two ways of tackling the health agenda. Obesity in young people, if I was the director of my public health, he would say the most important thing is eating. That if you were to have a fizzy drink and chocolate bar, you need to do an hour of active exercise to burn off the calories. But he would also say that having a lifestyle based on exercise is important as well. And so to me, it's eating and exercise in order to tackle some of the issues of obesity and to challenge some of the other activities that are an alternative to exercise and an active lifestyle, which we all know young people are privy to. So we want to develop positive activities, and those positive activities I referred to a little while ago in terms of youth diversion, some of the gang culture that we have, and I know other local authorities in London have. So we work with the police, and they've developed some activities around dodgeball and around boxing. So they're developing that as part of the process. Making the most of our leisure centres, we have an off-peak charge, again at that time of austerity, to make sure that people are not priced out. And making most of our parks, we're quite lucky in Enfield, we have 129 parks and open spaces. And how can you develop them and use them in a way to encourage people? And there are some, I think, simple and straightforward ways, open air gyms, for example, and one of the things that we were looking at is just putting simple markers in the park so that people know when they've walked or run a mile or 2 miles or 3 miles. Pretty low cost, but an ability to assist. So moving finally to the end of my presentation. We think it's important to develop the infrastructure to make these things work. You have to link into the activities in schools. We want to improve the life of our residents, and we're developing a cycling strategy, partly using mayoral money in order to develop cycleways through the borough. Developing inter-school competition, to develop at all levels. But it is important to us that we're not only looking at the A team, but we're looking at the B team, the C team, the D team in schools. There needs to be a place for everybody in this. Increasing the number of residents who take part in activity, and I refer to our outdoor gyms. There are challenges, and I've laid out some of the challenges, and some of them are funding, and some of them are priorities. Some of them, I think, are about a state of mind. There are challenges, but I think as a local authority, we see our role as coordinating within the local authority's area, trying to bring together all those partners who can play a part in order to achieve the best outcome. The Olympics were inspiring. The Olympics were incredibly exciting, and in any event, I think, in human minds, things tend to dissipate over a period of time. We have a role to keep that torch burning, and I think all the people in this room will undoubtedly share that. I think creating the structural and funding ways to do that is important, and all I can say from Enfield's point of view is we're committed to ensure that's a success. Thank you.